The smell of burnt grass still hung in the air when Verisk opened her eyes. She did not wake slowly, the way old dragons often do. She woke all at once, like a storm breaking, because something deep inside her chest had gone cold and empty. A mother always knows. Long before her eyes could see the damage, her heart already understood that something was wrong with her nest. She lifted her great head from the stone ledge where she had slept for 11 nights, guarding 6 eggs that held the last hope of her bloodline. The nesting ground was carved into the side of a cliff on the planet Ondura, a place chosen because it was hard to reach and harder to attack. Sharp winds cut through the canyon below, and jagged rocks made climbing nearly impossible for anything without wings. It was supposed to be safe. It was not safe anymore. Verisk rose to her feet, and her claws scraped against broken shell. 5 eggs lay shattered around her, their insides long gone cold, their shells crushed as if something had smashed through them with great force. She let out a sound that was not quite a roar and not quite a cry, something older than both, a sound that echoes only come from mothers who have lost what they were meant to protect. But there were 6 eggs. She counted the broken shells twice, her golden eyes moving carefully over every piece. 5. Only 5. The 6th was gone. Her first thought was rage. Her second thought, quieter and more dangerous, was hope. If the 6th egg had been smashed like the others, its shell would be here too, among the wreckage. It was not. Someone, or something, had taken it whole. Verisk lowered her head to the stone and began to search, moving with the slow, careful patience of a hunter rather than the wild fury of a grieving beast. She had lived for over 300 years. She had seen empires rise from dust and turn back into dust again. She had learned, over centuries of loss, that fury solves nothing if it moves too fast to see the truth. And what she saw confused her. Scattered across the nesting ledge were claw marks from something big, something that had crashed in from above, probably a raider beast or a hired scavenger creature sent to steal eggs for sale on the Black Exchange. That explained the broken shells and the chaos. But near the edge of the ledge, half hidden beneath a fallen rock, she found something that did not match the destruction at all. Footprints. Small ones, 2 narrow feet, close together, walking with careful, measured steps rather than the heavy stomp of a predator. They did not smash through the wreckage the way the raiders' claws had. They moved around it, stepping between broken shell fragments as if trying not to disturb them further. Verisk lowered her snout close to the ground and studied the prints with the same care a scholar might give an ancient text. They were narrow. They had no claws, no scales, no fur markings pressed into the dirt. Whatever left them walked on 2 feet, upright, light on its toes, careful in a way that made her pause. A predator does not walk carefully around its prey. A predator does not tiptoe. She followed the trail along the ledge and found more clues that puzzled her further. Near where her missing egg had rested, there was a small patch of disturbed soil, as if someone had knelt down. Beside it lay a torn scrap of cloth, rough and gray, the kind used to patch old flight suits. It had been wrapped loosely around a stone, perhaps used to carry the egg without touching it directly. Verisk's scouts arrived soon after, alerted by her cries. They were smaller dragons, younger, quick in flight, and eager to please their elder. They took one look at the destruction and began speaking over each other, blaming raiders, blaming rival packs, blaming anyone but the truth staring up at them from the dirt. One of them, a sharp-eyed scout named Torvin, pointed toward the horizon. Not far from the cliffs, past the razorgrass fields, sat a small human outpost. It had arrived on Ondura only 10 years earlier, a modest trading colony built by settlers looking for a quiet corner of the galaxy to call home. Torvin suggested, carefully, that the humans might be responsible. Varys considered this. She knew of humans, as most dragons did, mostly through rumor and second-hand stories carried across star systems. They were said to be short-lived creatures, fragile in body, without claws or fangs, or any natural weapon worth fearing. Some said they were clever. Some said they were dangerous in numbers, though rarely alone. None of it matched footprints this careful, this quiet, this deliberately gentle around the wreckage of a stolen nest. Still, a trail was a trail, and Verisk had learned patience across 3 centuries of life. She would not attack blindly. She would follow the footprints and see for herself what kind of creature left them. She spread her enormous wings, dark as scorched iron, and lifted off from the cliff ledge. Below her, the small prince continued along a worn path through the razor grass, careful and steady, moving away from the destruction rather than toward some hidden lair. It did not walk like a thief fleeing a crime. It walked like something moving with purpose, unafraid of being followed, as if it had nothing to hide. For 3 days, Verisk tracked the trail across broken ground, through collapsed tunnels left behind by old mining operations, and along the edge of a dry riverbed where the footprints grew clearer in the soft mud. Each day she found small signs that deepened her confusion rather than settling it. A patch of dug earth here, a trail of drag marks there, gentle, not violent. Once, she found a second set of smaller prints beside the first, handprints, pressed lightly into the dirt as if someone had knelt down to examine something small and fragile. By the third night, the trail led her to the edge of the human settlement, and then past it, toward a lone structure sitting apart from the rest, half buried into a hillside at the outpost's furthest edge. Smoke rose faintly from a vent in its roof. Verisk landed a short distance away, folded her wings, and studied the small, quiet shelter with narrowed eyes. Whatever waited inside, she intended to find out exactly what had happened to her egg. Rain had not fallen on Ondura in weeks, yet the small shelter at the edge of the human outpost smelled faintly of wet earth and warm fur. It was an odd smell for a dragon to notice first, but Verisk's senses had sharpened with age, and she trusted them more than her eyes in moments like this. She stood outside the low structure, her massive frame throwing a shadow across its metal roof, and waited to see what kind of enemy would dare live so close to a place she had come to burn. No enemy came. Instead, the door slid open with a soft mechanical groan, and a woman stepped out into the evening light. She was older, her hair streaked gray, her clothes patched and practical rather than fine. She did not carry a weapon. She did not call for help. She simply looked up at the towering dragon standing over her home and let out a slow breath, as if she had been expecting this moment for days. "You must be her mother," the woman said. Verisk's first instinct was disbelief. No creature spoke to a grieving dragon with such calm, especially not one small enough to be crushed beneath a single claw. She lowered her head until her enormous eye was level with the woman's face, searching for fear, for a trick, for anything that made sense of this scene. She found none. The woman's hands were steady. Her voice did not shake. "My name is Dara," the woman continued. "I think what you're looking for is inside." Verisk considered destroying the shelter on the spot. It would have been easy, and after days of grief and confusion, some old part of her wanted to. But something about the woman's calmness held her back, some instinct sharper than anger. She followed Dara through the low doorway instead, ducking her massive head beneath the frame, claws scraping against metal as she squeezed her body into a space clearly never built for something her size. Inside, the shelter was nothing like what she expected from someone capable of stealing a dragon egg. There were no cages built for prisoners, no locks, no chains. Instead, small pens lined the walls, each one holding an injured creature of some kind. A wounded skitter hawk with a broken wing rested in a nest of soft cloth. A pair of burrow foxes, native to Ondura's plains, slept curled together in a warm corner. Every animal looked cared for, fed, and calm, despite the enormous predator now standing in their midst. "I find them like this," Dara explained, noticing the dragon's confusion. "Hurt, abandoned, or left behind by things that don't want them anymore. Most people around here think I'm strange for it. I don't mind." Verisk barely heard her. Her attention had already moved past the pens toward the far corner of the shelter, where a small mound of warmed sand sat beneath a cluster of makeshift heating lamps, wires running from an old flight suit's battery pack. Wrapped loosely in gray cloth, half buried in the sand, was her egg. It was whole. It was warm. And as she stared, she saw it move. A sound followed, faint and rhythmic, a tiny tapping from somewhere deep within the shell. Verisk's breath caught in her throat, an old, forgotten feeling rushing back into her chest all at once. She moved closer, ignoring everything else in the room, until her snout hovered just above the sand. "She started doing that 2 days ago," Dara said quietly, careful not to startle the dragon towering above her. "I've been keeping her warm ever since I found her." She was cold when I got to her. Cracked a little near the edge, like something had dropped her. Or maybe she rolled off somewhere high. I didn't know if she'd make it through the first night. Verisk turned her head sharply toward the woman, old suspicion rising again despite everything she had seen. You expect me to believe you saved her out of kindness? Nothing more. Dara did not flinch from the question, nor did she look away. I don't expect you to believe anything, she said simply. I just know what I found, and I know what I did about it. You can decide the rest for yourself. There was no demand for payment in her voice, no offer of ransom, no fear dressed up as innocence. Verisk had encountered liars before, plenty of them across 3 centuries of dealing with smaller, cleverer species. She knew what desperation sounded like, and what greed sounded like dressed in soft words. This was neither. This was simply a woman stating a fact and letting a dragon decide what to make of it. Verisk studied the shelter more closely now, noticing details she had missed in her first shock. Handwritten notes were pinned to the wall near the egg, tracking temperature readings every few hours through the night. Small marks showing when the egg had shifted position, when it had grown warmer, when it had gone still with worry. Someone had stayed awake through many long nights simply to make sure a stranger's egg did not die alone in the cold. The rage that had carried Verisk across 3 days of tracking began to shift into something else, something she did not have an easy word for. Suspicion remained, but it now sat beside a small, stubborn seed of gratitude she was not ready to admit out loud. As if sensing the moment, the egg gave a sharp crack, and a thin line spread across its shell. Dara knelt beside it immediately, her movements slow and careful, giving the mother enough space to watch without feeling pushed aside. Verisk lowered her head until it nearly touched the sand, every instinct in her ancient body focused entirely on the small, fragile cracks spreading wider by the second. Whatever answers she still needed could wait. For now, there was only the sound of a shell breaking open, and the first breath of a hatchling that, by all reasonable odds, should never have survived at all. The shell broke apart slowly, piece by piece, and neither Verisk nor Dara moved, both of them frozen by the same fragile moment for entirely different reasons. Inside the shelter, the only sound was the soft crackle of the heating lamps and the faint, wet breathing of something small fighting its way into the world. Verisk had seen hundreds of eggs hatch across her long life, some her own, some belonging to sisters and cousins long since gone. She knew the process well, the slow widening of the crack, the exhausted stillness that came right before the final push. What she did not expect was the tight knot forming in her chest as she watched this particular hatchling struggle, knowing how close it had come to never struggling at all. The last piece of shell fell away, and a small, wet creature blinked up into the dim light of the shelter. Its scales were a pale shade of gray, still soft, still forming, and its wings were folded tight against its body like crumpled paper waiting to dry. It let out a thin, hoarse cry, the first sound of a life that had almost ended before it began. Dara reached forward instinctively, the way she had reached toward every wounded creature that had ever crossed her doorstep, gently wrapping the hatchling in dry cloth to keep her warm. It was a small, practical gesture, born from years of habit rather than any grand intention. But the moment the cloth touched the hatchling's skin, the little dragon turned toward the warmth, toward the woman's hands, and let out a soft, satisfied sound. Verisk watched this happen and felt something twist uncomfortably inside her. A hatchling's first instinct should be to seek its mother, her scent, her warmth, the rumble of her breathing. This one turned toward a human instead, toward the only warmth it had ever known since cracking free of its shell. That's normal, Dara said quietly, noticing the dragon's stiffened posture. She's been hearing my voice and feeling my hands near her for days now, through the shell. Animals do that. They bond to whatever keeps them safe first. It doesn't mean she loves you any less. She just doesn't know you yet. Verisk lowered her head slowly, bringing her enormous eye close to the tiny hatchling cradled in human hands. Up close, she could see her daughter's features clearly for the first time, the shape of her jaw, the faint ridges beginning to form along her spine, small details that marked her unmistakably as Verisk's own child. And yet the hatchling's wide eyes were fixed not on her mother, but on the woman holding her. It should have angered her. Some old, proud part of her wanted it to. Instead, She found herself thinking of the notes pinned to the wall, the careful temperature readings taken every few hours through the night, the scrap of cloth wrapped gently around a stone to carry a fragile egg without cracking it further. Whatever bond had formed here had not been stolen. It had been earned, slowly, through nights of quiet, careful work that no one had asked Dara to do. Why? Verisk finally asked, her voice lower now, less like a threat and more like a genuine question. You knew what I was capable of. You knew a dragon might come looking and might not stop to ask questions before attacking. Why risk your life for an egg that wasn't yours? Dara looked down at the hatchling in her arms before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than proud. I didn't think about what you were capable of, she said. I thought about what she was. Small, cold, about to die if nobody did anything. That's usually enough for me to make a decision. She gestured toward the rest of the shelter, toward the wounded skitter hawk and the sleeping burrow foxes and half a dozen other creatures tucked into careful corners. None of them asked to be born into danger either. I don't weigh how big or dangerous something might become someday. I just look at what's in front of me right now. It was, Verisk realized, an answer stripped of every excuse she had prepared herself to hear. No mention of reward. No fear disguised as virtue. Just a simple, stubborn kindness that did not calculate risk before acting. Still, 3 centuries of survival had taught Verisk not to trust easily, even in the face of evidence that pointed toward trust. She studied Dara for a long moment, searching for cracks in her story, inconsistencies in her calm. She found none. Every detail matched, from the drag marks near the nest to the careful footprints that avoided disturbing the wreckage, to the handwritten notes now curling slightly from the shelter's dry heat. The raiders, Verisk said finally. The ones who destroyed my other eggs. Did you see them? Dara shook her head slowly. Not directly. I heard something crash through the canyon that night. Saw smoke rising near the cliffs the next morning. By the time I climbed up to check, most of the damage was already done. I found her rolled to the edge, cracked and cold, probably knocked loose during the attack. I didn't stop to look for whoever did it. I just grabbed her and ran. That detail, small as it was, settled something uneasy in Verisk's chest. A raider would have taken the whole clutch, or destroyed it entirely out of spite. Dara had taken nothing except the one life she could still save, and had spent every day since trying to keep that single promise. The hatchling stirred again in Dara's arms, letting out another small cry, hungrier now than frightened. Verisk lowered her head instinctively, some deep maternal reflex overriding all her careful suspicion, and let out a low, rumbling sound meant to soothe. To her surprise, the hatchling turned toward the sound this time, small and curious, recognizing something ancient and familiar buried beneath all the strangeness of the last few days. It was not trust yet, not fully, but it was a beginning, and for the first time since finding her nest destroyed, Verisk allowed herself to believe that this particular ending might not be the tragedy she had feared. Whatever came next, whatever explanation still needed uncovering about the attack on her nest, she now understood one thing clearly. The danger to her daughter had never come from the small, careful footprints she had followed for 3 days. It had come from something else entirely, something still out there, still unaccounted for, and Verisk intended to find it. Word travels fast in a small colony, and fear travels even faster. By the time the sun rose fully over the outpost the next morning, half the settlement already believed a dragon had come to destroy them in revenge for a crime no one there had actually committed. It began with a single frightened trader who had spotted Verisk's enormous shadow passing low over the settlement 2 nights earlier, on her way toward Dara's shelter. He told 2 neighbors, who told 4 more, and by morning the story had grown into something far larger and far more dangerous than the truth. A dragon was hunting the colony. A dragon believed the humans had stolen her eggs. A dragon meant to burn the outpost to the ground unless someone stopped her first. None of it was true, but truth rarely moves as quickly as fear. The colony's small defense militia gathered before breakfast had even finished, a mismatched group of settlers armed with whatever weapons the outpost's limited supply could offer. Most had never fired a shot in anger. Few had ever seen a dragon up close, let alone one large enough to blot out the sun. Still, they marched together toward the edge of the settlement, toward the lone shelter that sat closest to where the dragon had last been seen. Inside that shelter, Verisk had spent the night curled protectively around her hatchling, watching the newborn dragon sleep against a nest of warm cloth, while Dara moved quietly between her other rescued animals, checking wounds and refilling water dishes with the same careful patience she gave everything under her roof. Neither of them noticed the growing noise outside until it was almost too late. It was the hatchling who reacted first, letting out a small, startled cry at the sound of approaching footsteps and raised voices. Verisk's head snapped up instantly, every instinct honed by centuries of danger now fully alert. She rose to her feet, wings half spread, ready to defend her daughter against whatever threat had found them. "Wait," Dara said sharply, stepping quickly between the dragon and the shelter's entrance. "Let me handle this first." Verisk hesitated, torn between trust earned over the past day and the deep instinct to place herself between her child and any approaching danger. But something in Dara's voice held her back, the same steady calm that had stopped her from destroying the shelter on the very first night. She lowered herself slightly, wings still raised, and allowed the woman to step outside alone. Dara emerged from the shelter to find nearly 30 armed settlers gathered a short distance away, weapons raised, fear plain on every face. At the front of the group stood a broad-shouldered man everyone called Foreman Reyes, the closest thing the outpost had to an official leader. He held up a hand, signaling the others to hold their fire, though his eyes never left the shelter's entrance behind her. "Dara, get away from there," Reyes called out, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "We saw it flying 2 nights ago. It's here for revenge, and we're not about to let it burn this whole colony down over something none of us did." "Nobody's burning anything down," Dara replied, her voice calm but firm enough to carry across the gathered crowd. "You've got this wrong. Completely wrong." She explained quickly, without exaggeration or unnecessary detail, exactly what had happened over the past several days. The raid on the dragon's nest. The egg she had found cracked and dying at the edge of the destruction. The nights spent keeping it warm, and the hatchling that had finally broken free just the evening before. She made it clear, as plainly as she could, that the dragon standing behind her had no interest in punishing a colony that had nothing to do with the attack. Reyes did not lower his weapon immediately. Fear, once it takes root in a crowd, rarely leaves quickly, no matter how reasonable the explanation offered against it. "And you expect us to just trust that?" he asked. "Trust a dragon not to turn on us the moment it decides we're not useful anymore?" It was at this moment that Verisk chose to step forward, moving slowly and deliberately from the shelter's entrance, her enormous frame casting a long shadow across the gathered crowd. Several settlers stumbled backward, weapons trembling in unsteady hands. Dara did not move from where she stood, positioning herself firmly between the dragon and the nervous line of guns without a hint of hesitation. "If I wanted this settlement destroyed," Verisk said, her voice low and heavy enough to make the ground seem to tremble beneath it, "you would already know it. I did not come here for revenge. I came following footprints that led me to the only creature on this world who tried to save what your neighbors nearly let die." She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd before continuing. "Your kind killed nothing of mine. Something else did, something still out there among your borders, something none of you have caught. I suggest you spend less time aiming weapons at those who helped me, and more time worrying about who actually attacked my nest in the first place." A tense silence spread through the crowd, broken only by the nervous shifting of feet and the soft, distant cry of the hatchling still waiting inside the shelter. Reyes lowered his weapon slowly, though his expression remained wary, unconvinced but no longer certain enough to act on that uncertainty. It was Dara who finally broke the silence completely, stepping forward with the same quiet confidence she had shown from the very beginning. "You all know me," she said, looking around at faces she had lived beside for years. "You know what I do out here, and you know I wouldn't put this colony in danger without good reason. Trust that, if nothing else." Slowly, reluctantly, weapons began to lower across the crowd. Reyes held Verisk's gaze a moment longer, searching for any sign of the threat he had come prepared to fight, before finally giving a short, tense nod and ordering his people to stand down. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring uneasily among themselves, Verisk turned back toward the shelter, toward the small, worried sound of her daughter still waiting inside. She had come to Ondura's outpost prepared for battle, expecting deception at every turn. Instead, she had found a woman willing to stand unarmed between a dragon and her own frightened neighbors, simply because she believed it was the right thing to do. Whatever threat still remained out there among the settlement's borders, Verisk now understood clearly that it was not the humans she needed to fear. It was whoever had truly attacked her nest, and that enemy was still out there, waiting to be found. 2 days after the standoff at the settlement's edge, Verisk stood once again at the ruins of her nesting ground, this time with company she never expected to bring along. Dara walked beside her, a worn pack slung over one shoulder, moving carefully across the broken shells and scorched stone with the same quiet attention she gave everything in her life. "You don't have to come," Verisk said, not for the first time since leaving the shelter that morning. The hatchling had been left safely behind, tucked into warm cloth under the watchful eye of one of the young dragon scouts, Torvin, who had reluctantly agreed to babysitting duty despite his obvious discomfort with the arrangement. "I know I don't have to," Dara replied, crouching beside a scattered set of tracks half buried near the cliff's edge. "But I've seen these same drag marks before, near my shelter, about 3 weeks back. Something took a wounded burrow fox right out of its den one night, left tracks just like these leading off toward the eastern ridge. I never had a reason to follow them until now." Verisk studied the marks Dara pointed toward, wide grooves cut into the dirt, spaced with the uneven rhythm of something large dragging a heavy container behind it. It matched the destruction at the nest exactly, the same brutal efficiency, the same complete disregard for anything left behind except what could be sold. "Scavengers," Verisk said, her voice low and hard. "Not hunters looking for food. Something organized, moving eggs and wildlife off-world for buyers who don't care where any of it comes from." Dara nodded grimly, having suspected as much for weeks without any solid proof to act on. "There's been talk in the settlement, too. A ship's been landing out past the eastern ridge every few nights, always after dark, always gone before sunrise. Reyes assumed it was smugglers avoiding trade taxes. Nobody thought to check what they were actually smuggling. Together, they followed the drag marks east, moving carefully across terrain that grew rockier and more treacherous with every mile. Verisk flew low along the ridgeline while Dara tracked signs on the ground below, calling out changes in direction whenever the trail bent around obstacles too narrow for a full-grown dragon to follow easily from the air. It was slow work, but steady, and by late afternoon they had reached the edge of a narrow canyon hidden between 2 steep rock walls, invisible from the settlement and difficult to spot even from above. Verisk landed on a ridge overlooking the canyon and immediately understood why the raiders had chosen this location. Tucked against the far wall sat a squat, ugly transport ship, its hull scarred and patched from years of hard use. Beside it stood a row of metal cages, and even from this distance, Verisk could make out shapes moving within them, some small, some larger, all clearly distressed. "Eggs," she said quietly, her claws digging into the stone beneath her. "They're still holding eggs." Dara crouched low beside her, studying the camp with careful eyes. "I count maybe 6 of them moving around down there. Could be more inside the ship. This isn't just about your nest. They've been doing this for a while, hitting anything valuable across this whole region." Verisk felt old anger rising again, sharper now that she understood the full scope of what had happened. This was not a single desperate act against her family. It was a business, calculated and cold, treating living creatures as nothing more than cargo to be sold to the highest off-world buyer. Somewhere in those cages might be eggs stolen from other dragons, other mothers who had spent days searching for answers just as she had. "We move carefully," Dara said, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "You go in loud, from the front. Draw their attention, keep them focused on you. I'll circle around from the ridge and start getting those cages open while they're distracted." Verisk turned to look at her, surprised again by the calm, practical confidence in the plan. "You would walk directly toward armed raiders, alone, with no weapon beyond whatever you're carrying in that pack." "I've got a cutting tool for the cage locks, and I know this terrain better than they do," Dara said simply. "Besides, you'll be busy enough that they won't have time to worry about one more person moving through the shadows." There was no arguing with the logic, and little time left to debate it further. Verisk spread her wings and rose from the ridge, circling once before diving directly toward the canyon floor with a roar that shook loose small stones from the surrounding cliffs. The raiders below scattered in immediate panic, weapons firing wildly into the air as they scrambled for cover. None of their crude firearms built to handle a fully grown dragon descending on their camp with 3 centuries of fury behind her. While Verisk tore through their defenses with claw and fire, driving the panicked raiders away from the cages and toward the canyon's open ground, Dara moved quickly along the shadowed ridge exactly as planned. She reached the first row of cages within minutes, her cutting tool making short work of the crude locks, releasing a trembling burrow fox and 2 frightened skitter hawks before moving on to the next row. It was there, among the final cages, that she found what she had feared most: 3 dragon eggs, smaller than Verisk's, likely from a different nest entirely, huddled together beneath a thin heating cloth clearly meant to keep them alive just long enough to reach a buyer. Dara worked quickly, freeing them from their cage and wrapping them carefully in cloth from her pack, cradling all 3 against her chest as gunfire and roars continued to echo across the canyon behind her. The fight ended almost as quickly as it began. Verisk's fury, combined with the raiders' complete lack of preparation for facing a dragon directly, left the scavenger camp in ruins within minutes. Those who could still run fled toward their damaged ship, abandoning the operation entirely rather than risk further confrontation. Verisk let them go, her attention already turning toward the cages and whatever remained inside them. She found Dara waiting near the canyon's edge, 3 unfamiliar eggs cradled carefully in her arms, unharmed despite the chaos that had just torn through the camp around her. Verisk landed heavily beside her, breathing hard from the fight, and looked down at the eggs with something between relief and renewed anger. "Not mine," she said quietly, studying the shell's unfamiliar coloring. "Another mother's children." "Then we'll find her," Dara said simply, adjusting her grip on the fragile bundle in her arms. "Same as we found yours." Verisk looked at the woman beside her for a long moment, covered in dust and canyon dirt, utterly unshaken by everything she had just walked through, and felt the last of her old suspicion finally give way completely to something closer to respect. 3 weeks after the fight in the canyon, the settlement looked different, though nothing about its buildings had changed. What had shifted was harder to see, but impossible to miss: a quiet ease that had settled over the outpost, replacing the fear that once greeted any mention of the dragon living near its border. Verisk had returned the 3 rescued eggs to their rightful mother, a smaller dragon named Kestra who lived 2 ranges east, near a valley of black volcanic rock. The reunion had been emotional in the way only a mother finding her stolen children could be, and Kestra had wept openly at the sight of Dara, the small human who had carried her eggs to safety through gunfire and chaos without ever once considering leaving them behind. Word of what happened in the canyon spread quickly, first through the settlement, then across the wider network of dragons scattered throughout the region. The story grew with each telling, as stories often do, though the core of it remained stubbornly true no matter how it was retold. A human woman, alone and unarmed, had walked into a raider's camp to save eggs that were not hers, risking nothing less than her own life for creatures she had never met and owed nothing to. Back at the shelter, life continued much as it always had, though now with one significant addition. The hatchling, whom Dara had taken to calling Wisp for the soft, curling trail of smoke she sometimes puffed out while sleeping, had grown steadily stronger over the following weeks. Her scales had darkened from pale gray to a deep, warm bronze, and her wings, once crumpled and useless, now stretched proudly whenever she stumbled around the shelter chasing after the burrow foxes. Verisk visited daily, splitting her time between her duties among the other dragons of the region and the quiet hours spent watching her daughter grow within walls built by human hands. She had expected, in the early days, that Wisp's bond with Dara would fade naturally as the hatchling grew older, replaced eventually by the stronger pull of dragon instinct. It did not fade. One evening, as the sun set low over the settlement, painting the sky in deep shades of orange, Verisk found Dara sitting outside the shelter, mending a torn section of cloth while Wisp dozed nearby, curled contentedly against the older woman's side. Verisk settled down beside them, folding her wings carefully to avoid disturbing the peaceful scene. "I have been thinking," Verisk said slowly, choosing her words with the same care she once used only for matters of survival. "About what happens next. Wisp will grow. She will need training I cannot give her here, among your people. But she will also need what you have already given her: patience, warmth, the kind of care that does not come naturally to creatures raised only among dragons." Dara looked up from her mending, waiting quietly for the rest of what clearly weighed on the ancient dragon's mind. "I would ask you to stay close," Varys continued. "Not as a keeper, not as someone who owes me anything for what happened. As something else, something my kind has no old word for. A guardian, perhaps. Someone trusted with the safety of a nest, welcomed within it rather than kept apart from it." It was an unusual offer, one that broke from centuries of tradition among dragons who rarely allowed outsiders near their young, let alone invited them to remain permanently within reach of a nest. Dara considered the offer carefully, glancing down at Wisp's sleeping form curled trustingly against her side. "I've spent most of my life taking care of things nobody else wanted to bother with," Dara said finally. "Wounded animals, forgotten corners of this settlement, anything small and cold that needed somewhere warm to land. I never expected any of it to lead somewhere like this. But I think I'd like to stay, if you'll have me." Verisk lowered her head in something close to a bow, an old gesture reserved for equals rather than strangers, and felt the last of her ancient caution settle into something calmer, something closer to peace than she had felt since the night her nest was first destroyed. Over the following months, the shelter grew larger, expanded with help from settlers who had once feared the dragon, now regularly seen resting nearby. What had once been Dara's small, quiet refuge for wounded creatures became something larger, a place where dragons and humans crossed paths freely, where injured wildlife from both worlds received the same careful attention regardless of species. Foreman Reyes, once ready to lead an armed defense against Verisk, became one of the shelter's most frequent visitors, bringing supplies and, eventually, his own quiet friendship. Wisp grew quickly under the combined care of her mother and the woman who had saved her life before she ever took her first breath. She learned to fly under Verisk's careful guidance, tumbling awkwardly through the canyon winds before finally catching the rhythm of true flight. She learned patience and gentleness under Dara's steady hand, watching how the woman cared for even the smallest, most fragile creatures without ever once asking what they could offer in return. On quiet evenings, Verisk would often find herself watching the two of them together, her daughter curled protectively over some newly rescued animal exactly the way Dara had once curled protectively over her. And she would think back to the very beginning, to those small, careful footprints she had followed across 3 days of scorched earth and broken stone. She had expected, back then, to find an enemy at the end of that trail. Instead, she had found the beginning of something neither dragon nor human fully understood yet, but both had come to trust completely. The tiny footprints that once led a grieving mother across a ruined world had become, in the end, the first steps of a bond that neither species had planned for and neither now wished to give up. And on Ondura, beneath skies once filled only with suspicion between two very different kinds of survivors, a new kind of nest had quietly begun to take root, built not on scales or claws or ancient bloodlines, but on the simple, stubborn choice to protect what was small, cold, and worth saving.